The morning Jennie Brenner rode onto the Walden ranch. The sky above the Texas panhandle was the color of a bruise, purple and swollen at the edges, and she carried enough fury in her chest to match it. She had ridden 11 miles from the town of Caldwell Crossing, her chestnut mare lathered from the pace, her dark hair escaping its pins in wild strands across her cheeks, and her jaw set so hard that her back teeth ached. She had rehearsed every word she intended to say. She had lain awake 3 nights composing it all, stacking her arguments like stones in a wall, solid and immovable. She was 24 years old, she had buried her father 6 weeks ago, and the Walden family had a debt to answer for. The year was 1878, and the panhandle of Texas was a place where a person could disappear into the grass and never be found. Ranches spread themselves across the land like sleeping giants, their fences eating up what had once been open range, and the men who owned those fences rarely answered to anyone but themselves. The Walden family had been among the first to stake their claim out here, running cattle from horizon to horizon, and for a long time that had made the name Walden mean something close to law in Caldwell Crossing. But to Jennie Brenner, the name Walden meant something else entirely. It meant a forged promissory note. It meant her father's shop signed over under duress to settle a debt that was never truly owed. It meant Robert Brenner, a gentle man who repaired boots and saddles and asked nothing of anyone, working himself into an early grave to pay rent on a building he had once owned outright, because Harold Walden had convinced a half-blind judge that the paperwork was legitimate. Harold Walden had died 2 years ago. The ranch now belonged to his son. Jennie pulled her mare to a stop at the gate of the property, stared up at the burned-wood sign that read WALDEN land and cattle, and breathed through her nose until the shaking in her hands steadied. She was not here to weep. She was here to demand an accounting. The ranch yard was already awake when she pushed through the gate. 2 ranch hands were moving hay bales near the barn, and a third was working the pump at the water trough. They all stopped and stared at the young woman riding in alone, her back straight as a fence post and her expression carved from granite. She did not stop to address any of them. She rode straight to the porch of the main house, a long, low-slung structure built from dark timber with a wide covered porch that ran its full length. She dismounted without ceremony, looped her mare's reins around the hitching post and climbed the 3 wooden steps without breaking stride. She knocked, loud, the kind of knock that meant she was not going away. There was a pause and then the door opened. Roscoe Walden was not what she had expected. She had built an image in her mind over years of bitterness, something dark and imperious and cruel-mouthed, shaped in the image of the father she despised. What she found instead was a man of perhaps 28, broad through the shoulders and lean through the middle, with a face that was weathered from honest outdoor work rather than softened by inherited ease. He had brown eyes the color of creek-bottom sediment after a rain, and there was nothing calculating in them. He looked at her with the plain, open attention of a man who had learned to look at things directly. He was holding a mug of coffee. He had clearly just come from the breakfast table. There was a line on his left cheek from the pillow, and his dark hair was not yet fully tamed. Jennie looked at him for exactly half a second, remapped her expectations, and kept going. "I am Jennie Brenner," she said, and her voice came out steady, which was a small miracle. "My father was Robert Brenner of Caldwell Crossing. Your father ruined him. I am here because I want you to look me in the eye and acknowledge what was done to my family, and I want to hear you say that you know it was wrong. I have waited long enough, and I am not leaving until I have that." Roscoe Walden stared at her. He set his coffee mug down on the porch railing very slowly, as if he was being careful not to spill it. He was quiet for a long moment, and Jennie braced herself for the defense, for the dismissal, for the lawyer words and the cold eyes that meant a man had decided she was not worth taking seriously. Instead, he said, "You are right. What my father did to your family was wrong. It was dishonest and it was cruel, and I am sorry for it. I am sorry it happened, and I am sorry I did not find a way to come and say so before now." Jennie blinked. That was not in any of her rehearsed scripts. He continued, his voice low and even, without performance or deflection. I found out about the note 3 years ago when I was going through my father's papers after he got sick. I knew it was forged. I knew what it meant for your family. I did not handle that the way I should have. I told myself there was nothing I could do without admitting to a crime that was his and not mine, and that was a coward's reasoning. So I am telling you now, plainly and without reservation, my father wronged your father and I am sorry. Is there anything else I can do? The morning wind moved across the porch between them, warm and smelling of grass and livestock and something distant that might have been rain. Jennie stood very still. The wall of argument she had built over 3 nights of wakefulness had expected resistance. It had no plans for this. She said after a moment that stretched itself thin, "I do not know yet." He nodded, as if that was a perfectly reasonable answer. "Would you like to come inside? I was just having breakfast. You have ridden a long way and so has your horse." Jennie looked at him. She looked at the yard behind her, at her mare already drinking from the trough where one of the hands had brought a bucket without being asked. She looked back at Roscoe Walden and she could not find the villain she had ridden 11 miles to confront. "All right," she said, "for a few minutes." She followed him inside. The house was not what she expected either. She had imagined something cold and grandiose, a monument to Harold Walden's pride, but the interior was plain and functional and lived in. There was a long table of dark wood, 4 chairs around it, a cast iron stove along one wall, and bookshelves beside the window that held an actual collection of books, not just ledgers. A braided rag rug on the floor. Curtains that had been sewn by someone with practical taste rather than extravagance. Roscoe poured her a mug of coffee without asking whether she wanted it, set it on the table, and moved to the stove to add another plate of eggs to the one sitting there keeping warm. He did all of this with the quiet economy of a man who had learned to cook for himself, and he did not hover or fuss. Jennie sat down. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the steam rising from it. "My father died 6 weeks ago," she said, not because she had planned to, but because it was sitting right there in her chest where it had been sitting for 6 weeks. Roscoe turned from the stove. "I heard. I am sorry for that too. He never stopped paying rent on that building," she said. "He paid it every month until he died. He never told anyone what had happened because he was ashamed. He thought people would think he had been foolish." "He was not foolish," Roscoe said. He brought the plate of eggs to the table, set it in front of her, and sat down across from her with his own coffee. "He was trusting, and my father was a man who knew how to exploit trust. That is not a failing of the person who trusted." Jennie looked at the eggs. She had not eaten that morning, having been too angry to think about food. She picked up the fork. "Why didn't you do something?" she asked. "When you found out?" It was not an accusation now. It was a genuine question. Roscoe was quiet for a moment. He turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. "Because I was 25 and I had just found out that my father was not the man I thought he was, and I did not know how to hold that. I told myself I would think on it. I told myself I would find the right way to approach it. And then it became a thing I was carrying that I could not put down and could not figure out, and the longer I carried it, the heavier it got." He stopped. "That is still not a good enough reason. It is just the true one." Jennie ate some of the eggs. They were good, seasoned simply, cooked without pretension. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten through the window, the bruised color breaking into something amber and clear. "The building is still being rented to someone?" Roscoe asked. "Yes, a family named Gorman. They sell dry goods. And you, where are you living?" "I have a room above the post office. I take in sewing and mending. I managed before my father passed and I will manage now." She said it without self-pity because it was simply true. "Is there a remaining balance on the rent your father paid?" Roscoe asked. "A record of what was paid in total." She looked at him. "What are you asking?" "I am asking because if there is a record of what was paid against a debt that was never legitimate, then the money paid against that debt was taken wrongfully. I would like to make that right if I can." He said it plainly, not as a grand gesture, not as a performance. He said it the way a man says something that is simply obvious to him. Jennie set her fork down very carefully. She had come here expecting to fight for basic acknowledgement, for someone to look her in the eye and say yes, that happened, yes, it was wrong. She had not come expecting anyone to talk about repair. The idea of it landed on her like something she had not been prepared to carry. "I kept my father's ledgers," she said slowly. "He recorded every payment." "Then I would like to see them," Roscoe said. "When you are ready and when it suits you. There is no rush, but I want you to know that the offer is genuine." She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the window now, full and honest, and she could see him clearly, the small scar below his chin, the way his hands were calloused from real work, the steadiness in his eyes that was not the steadiness of a man performing calm, but of a man who had genuinely thought about something and made up his mind. She thought about the 11 miles she had ridden in fury, and arrived at something she had not expected, which was uncertainty. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because it is the right thing," he said. "And because I have been wanting to do the right thing in this matter for 3 years, and not doing it has cost me more sleep than you might think. I am not looking for credit. I am looking to stop carrying something I should not be carrying." Jennie picked her fork back up. She finished her eggs. She drank her coffee. She did not say anything else for a few minutes, and neither did he, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her more than anything else that morning had produced. Eventually she said, "I will bring the ledgers, not today, I need to think." "Whenever you are ready," he said. She stood, straightened her skirt, and reached for her hat from the peg by the door where she had hung it without thinking when she came in. She paused with the hat in her hands. "You are not what I expected," she said. "I know," he said. "I reckon I am not what my father was either. I have spent a good portion of my life trying to make sure of that." She put on her hat. She went back outside. She untied her mare, mounted without difficulty, and rode back down the ranch lane toward the road. She did not look back. But she was thinking about the steadiness of his eyes, and the way he had said it was the right thing as if there were no other possible answer, and the fact that the space between her shoulder blades, which had been knotted with tension for 6 weeks, had loosened a little somewhere between the eggs and the coffee. She thought about that the whole 11 miles home. Jennie did not bring the ledgers that week, nor the next. She told herself she was busy, and this was partially true. She had 3 dresses to finish for the minister's wife, 2 pairs of trousers to mend for the blacksmith, and a quilt top to piece for a woman who had her baby in spring. She worked in the back room of the post office with her window facing east, and the light was good in the mornings, and she kept herself occupied. But in the evenings, when the light turned gold and the town of Caldwell Crossing settled into its after-supper quiet, she sat with her father's ledgers on the table in front of her, and she went through them. She had known in a general way what was in them, had seen her father writing in them all through her childhood, but she had never sat down and read them straight through, and doing so now was both painful and illuminating. Her father had been a meticulous man. Every entry was dated, every amount recorded in his careful small handwriting. She could trace the exact month that the payments to Walden land and cattle began, could see how the amount changed over the years as Harold Walden revised the rental terms upward, always by small increments, always just below the threshold that would make it worth a legal fight. She could see how her father had absorbed each increase without complaint, adding a line to his ledger and going on. What she had not fully understood before she sat down with these books was the total. She had known it was a significant sum. She had not known it was devastating. 14 years. 14 years of monthly payments on a building that should have been her father's free and clear, on a debt that had never been real. The total recorded in these careful columns was more money than Jennie had held in her hands in her entire life combined. She sat with that number for a long time one Tuesday evening, the lamplight warm and the distant sound of the saloon piano drifting through the open window, and she thought about Roscoe Walden sitting across a breakfast table saying, "That was still not a good enough reason," in a voice that carried actual shame. She wrapped the ledgers in oilcloth and put them in her saddlebag on Thursday morning. When she rode up to the Walden ranch that day, the yard was busy. 4 men were working cattle near the far corral, and the sound of it, the bellowing, the creak of rope and leather, the shouted instructions, carried clearly across the still air. A barn cat sat on the fence post by the gate and regarded her without concern. She found Roscoe at the corral fence, leaning on the top rail, watching 2 of his hands work a young steer. He turned when he heard her horse, and he did not look surprised, only steady, and he came to meet her. "Miss Brenner," he said. "I brought the ledgers," she said. She held out the oilcloth bundle. He took it carefully, as though he understood the weight of what he was holding, which had nothing to do with the physical heft of 2 worn books. "Would you come in? I will look at these properly." She came in. He made coffee again, and she sat at the same chair at the long table, and he sat across from her with the ledgers open and went through them quietly, turning pages with an attention that did not waver. He was thorough. He did not rush. He did not make sound effects of discomfort or try to minimize what he was reading. When he had finished, he closed the second book and held it between his palms for a moment with his eyes on the table. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "I cannot repay this in a lump," he said, meeting her eyes. "I want to be honest with you about that. The ranch carries debt of its own, and the honest position is that I am working through it year by year, but I can start, and I will start now, and I will put it in writing so you have something binding." Jennie looked at him. "I am not asking you to bankrupt yourself. I know you are not," he said, "but I am telling you what I intend to do, and I want to do it properly, not just as a handshake. I want there to be a document that says what was owed and what is being repaid, so that if something happens to either of us, the record is clear." She had not thought about it that way. She had thought about it as personal, as something between her and the name Walden, but the idea of a formal record, a document that would exist independent of either of their intentions, was something else. It was acknowledgement in ink. Who would draw up such a document, she asked. "There is a lawyer in town. Monroe at the Assier's office does simple contracts. I would have him look at it." He paused. "Unless you do not trust my choice of lawyer." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "We could use him. I would want to read it before signing." "Of course," he said. "I would expect nothing less." They worked out the arrangement over the next half hour with a practicality that felt, to Jennie, oddly companionable. He was not trying to minimize. She was not trying to extract more than was fair. They talked through numbers and timelines with a mutual directness that reminded her of the way she talked to her father when they were working out a business question together, as equals with a shared problem to solve. When they had settled the outline, she looked up from the paper where she had been jotting figures and found him watching her. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable. Just watching, with the same straightforward attention he seemed to give everything. "You write clearly," he said. "I noticed it before in your handwriting on those figures. My father taught me. He said a person who cannot keep their own accounts is a person who will be cheated." A pause, which he was in the end, but the teaching was still good. "It was," Roscoe said. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but close to one. "He sounds like he was a careful man." "He was a good man," she said. "He was gentle in ways that people sometimes mistook for weakness." "He was not weak. He was just not built for cruelty the way some people are." "I think not being built for cruelty is an undervalued quality," Roscoe said. She looked at him again. That steadiness in his eyes again. She picked up her pencil and looked back at the paper. "I should go," she said, when the figures were all set down and there was nothing left to resolve that day. "I will come to the lawyer's office on Tuesday if that suits." "Tuesday suits," he said. He stood when she stood, the manners instinctive, and walked her back out to the porch. Her mare was at the trough again. The sky above the panhandle was enormous and clear, the blue of it deep and permanent looking, the way it got when there was no weather for 100 miles. A hawk circled in the far distance, lazy and patient. "Thank you," she said, though she had not entirely planned to. "There is nothing to thank me for," he said. "I am doing what should have been done a long time ago." She rode home, but she rode more slowly than she had ridden out. The fury had gone somewhere, had turned into something she did not have a name for yet, something that was not comfortable but was not entirely unpleasant. The agreement was drawn up by Monday and signed on Tuesday, witnessed by old Monroe at the Assier's office, who looked over his spectacles at the two of them with an expression of polite curiosity that he was too professional to voice. The document set out the total amount owed and a schedule of quarterly payments, beginning at the end of the month. It was witnessed and signed, and a copy was given to each party. Jennie rolled her copy and put it in her satchel. She shook Roscoe's hand outside Monroe's office door, and the handshake was firm and quick, but she noticed that his hand was warm, and that he held on for exactly the right amount of time and no longer. That night she took her copy of the agreement out and read it twice before bed. She set it in the tin box where she kept the deed to nothing, her father's watch, and 3 letters from a school friend in Kansas she had not seen in years. She did not expect to see Roscoe Walden again until the first payment was due. He appeared at the post office 12 days later. She was at the counter mailing a letter for Mrs. Hawthorne when she heard boots on the plank sidewalk outside and looked up as he came through the door, hat in hand. He was in town for feed and fencing supplies, he said, which was the plain truth and not an excuse because the feed store receipt was visible in his front shirt pocket. But after the supplies were squared away, he had stopped in to see if she needed anything. She looked at him. "Needed anything," she repeated. "It is a stupid thing to say," he admitted. "What I meant was, I was in town and I found myself thinking about whether you were all right. That is all." Jennie turned to Mrs. Hawthorne and completed the transaction with perfect composure, and when the older woman had gone she turned back to Roscoe and said, "I am all right, are you?" He blinked. Not many people, she suspected, turned the question back on him. "Yes," he said, and then after a pause, "I am better than I have been in some time, if I am honest." "Why?" "Because the thing I was carrying is lighter," he said. "I told you it would be." She thought about that. She thought about her own shoulders, which had been carrying something for 6 weeks, or truthfully for much longer than that, and whether they were lighter too. "Would you have supper with me?" he asked. It came out direct but not without vulnerability, and she appreciated that he did not try to dress it up as something other than what it was. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 11 miles she had ridden in fury, and the eggs she had been given without asking, and the way he said "I am sorry" and meant every syllable. "Yes," she said, "I would." They had supper at the Caldwell Cross dining room, which was the only establishment in town where a person could sit down to a meal that was not at a saloon. The proprietor, a wide-shouldered woman named Mrs. Tate, seated them by the window with a knowing look she did not bother to conceal, and brought them chicken and biscuits and a pot of coffee without consulting the menu, since there was only one option for Thursday's dinner and everyone knew it. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the ledgers, not about the legal agreement, not about anything that had brought them to the point of sitting across from each other in the first place. They talked about the land, about what the panhandle had looked like when both their families were newer to it. Roscoe said he had a memory of seeing a buffalo herd from the top of the water tower his father was building when Roscoe was about 7 years old, and that the herd stretched so far in every direction he could not see the edge of it, and that by the time he was 12 the buffalo were nearly gone. He said it matter-of-factly, but with something behind it that was not entirely comfortable, a recognition of what that meant. Jennie said her father had talked about the same thing, about what the land had been before the ranches and the fences, about the Comanche who had ridden it freely for generations before the cattle barons came, and the army cleared the way for them. She said her father had not been a political man, but he had been an honest one, and honesty required acknowledging that what had been built here had been built on something taken, the same way what had been taken from her family was real regardless of whether the law had initially agreed. Roscoe looked at her for a moment after that. "You think about things carefully," he said. "I had a father who believed in doing so," she said. And then I had enough anger to fuel a great deal of careful thinking about a great many subjects." He smiled at that, a real smile, unhurried, that changed his face considerably. She had the thought that he did not smile easily, but that when he did, it was the full version, nothing held back. She liked that. She did not say so, but she noted it, the way she noted the precise moment when a seam was coming right, the way she noted a clean color in a bolt of fabric. They walked back from Mrs. Tate's dining room in the blue evening, the main street of Caldwell crossing quiet around them, the last of the summer light lingering on the western ridgeline. He walked her to the door at the side of the post office building that led up to her room, and he stood on the lower step so that they were nearly the same height, and he said, "I would like to do this again." "Supper." She said, "Talking," he said. "With supper included, yes." She almost smiled. "All right," she said, "but I will warn you, I have a great many opinions." "I noticed," he said, and there it was again, that full version smile. She went inside. She sat on the edge of her cot for a full 5 minutes before she remembered she had mending to do. The summer deepened. The Texas panhandle baked under a white sky, and the grass went brittle and gold, and the cattle ranged toward whatever water remained. Roscoe was working long days, the kind of summer that tested a ranch, and yet he found Jennie on Sundays, which was the one day the ranch ran on reduced hands and a man could breathe. He came into Caldwell Crossing on his big gray horse and found her, and they fell into the habit of taking a slow afternoon together, sometimes at Mrs. Tate's, sometimes walking the creek trail that wound east of town through the cottonwoods, sometimes simply sitting on the post office steps while the town went quiet around them. She told him about her childhood, about the smell of the leatherwork shop, about learning to stitch saddle leather when she was 10 because her father said a Brenner should be able to do the work, about reading every book the town's small library possessed before she was 15 and writing to a cousin in Kansas City for more. He listened to all of it the way he did everything, fully, without checking his attention. He told her about growing up in the shadow of a father who was admired and feared in equal measure, about understanding early that admiration and respect were not the same thing. He told her about the year he was 16 and worked a cattle drive up to Kansas for a rancher named Hargrove because he wanted to earn something that was purely his own, not Walden money. He told her about the stars on that drive, how many there were and how far away from everything a person felt at 2 in the morning riding the night shift, and how he had thought that was possibly the most honest feeling he had ever had. She noticed that he never talked about the future as something he had mapped out. He talked about the land and the cattle and the work with investment, but about himself, about what he wanted, he was quieter, as if he had not quite settled the question. She wondered if she was the kind of person who unsettled questions in people, or the kind who helped settle them. She was still working that out about herself. One Sunday afternoon in August they were sitting by the creek, the water lower than it should have been but still moving, the cottonwood leaves turning silver in the afternoon wind. Jennie had her shoes off and her feet in the water, which was something she would not have done in anyone else's company but which felt, in his, entirely reasonable. He was sitting on the bank beside her, forearms on his knees, watching the water. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "Did your father ever apologize to you for anything?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He was not a man who apologized. He believed apology was weakness. He believed any acknowledgement of error created a door for someone to walk through and take something from you. A pause. I think that is why he did the things he did. He thought the world was one long negotiation and every man was looking for an advantage, so you had better find yours first. And you did not believe that," she said. "It was not quite a question." "I watched what it cost him," Roscoe said. "He got everything he went after mostly. The land, the cattle, the name. And he died in this big house with nobody in it but me, and I think he was afraid, though he would never have said so. I think he was afraid because he had spent his whole life making sure everyone owed him something, and he knew at the end that none of it meant anyone would grieve him." He stopped. I grieved him anyway. He was my father. But I think he died not believing that was possible. Jennie looked at the water moving over the stones of the creek bed, clear and unhurried. My father died with me holding his hand, she said. He said my name twice in the last hour, once clearly and once very softly. The last thing he said to me was that he hoped I would not be angry for too long because it was heavy to carry. He was right, Roscoe said. I know he was, she said. I am working on it. You came 11 miles in the early morning to say what needed saying, he said. That is not a person who is planning to stay angry. That is a person who is looking for a way out of it. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the water still, but there was something in the set of his mouth that was very nearly tender. You are perceptive, she said. For a cattle rancher, he said, and there was enough of a smile in it that she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed, really laughed, in more than 6 weeks. It surprised her, the sound of it, and then she let it go and did not try to take it back. He looked at her when she laughed, and something in his face went still and then very quiet, the way the creek went still in a deep pool. She stopped laughing eventually and looked at the water, and neither of them said anything for a while, and that was fine. September came in with the first cool edge in the evenings, the sky deepening from its summer white to something with more substance, more blues and purples and reds at the edges. The ranch work shifted from the punishing intensity of summer to the long, deliberate work of fall, getting the herd in order before winter, making sure the stores were sufficient, checking the fences and the outbuildings and all the things that needed to be right before the cold came. Jennie came to the ranch one Saturday to return a book she had borrowed from the shelf by the window, a worn copy of a history of the Republic of Texas that she had read with great interest and considerably more skepticism than its author intended. She found Roscoe in the yard fixing a section of fence that ran along the corral, setting posts with a methodical thoroughness that he gave to all physical work. She sat on the top rail of the corral and handed him tools when he needed them, which she quickly worked out by watching, and they talked while he worked. There was something about the rhythm of it that she liked, the conversation moving around the practical task rather than being the whole point, the way good talk often worked best when the hands were busy. Mid-morning, one of his ranch hands, a quiet older man named Silas who had been with the Walden property since before Roscoe took it over, came to the corral fence and said there was a problem at the east water tank, some kind of blockage in the feed pipe. Roscoe looked at the fence, looked at the tank, looked at Jennie. "Would you mind waiting?" he asked. "I could come," she said. He looked at her with a small expression of reassessment, and she recognized it because she had produced it in him more than once. He was checking whether the offer was politeness or genuine. "It is a long walk," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not afraid of walking." They walked to the east tank across a stretch of rolling grassland that smelled of sage and dry earth, with Silas alongside them. Silas turned out to be a man of few words but considerable expertise, and the problem with the feed pipe was resolved in 40 minutes. On the way back, with the problem behind them and the late morning sun warm on their faces, Silas fell behind a few steps and Jennie and Roscoe walked in step with each other across the grass. "You are not afraid of much," Roscoe said. It was not a compliment precisely, just an observation, though his tone gave it warmth. "I am afraid of plenty of things," she said. "I just do not always let it stop me." "What are you afraid of?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Becoming someone who is small because of what has happened to them," she said. "My father was not small. He went through something that would have made a different person bitter and closed, and he never let it. He kept his shop open, he fixed people's boots and saddles, he talked to his neighbors. He let his anger be private and his life be generous. I'm afraid that I will not manage the same." Roscoe was quiet for a pace or two. "I think you are already managing it," he said. "You rode 11 miles to ask for what was right instead of letting it rot inside you. That is not a small person. That is someone doing the harder thing." She thought about that. "What are you afraid of?" she asked. He did not answer immediately, and she respected that he was actually thinking about it. "Repeating him," he said. My father, not in the obvious ways, in the subtle ones. The shortcuts I might take without noticing, the reasoning that sounds good until you pull it open and find something less good inside. That is what I am afraid of, that I am more like him than I think. You are not like him, she said, and said it with enough certainty that he turned to look at her. You cannot know that, he said. You have known me 2 months. I know it from the apology, she said. Your father never apologized. You did, without being dragged to it, without defense. You did it because it was right. That is the difference. He held her eyes for a moment. The grass around them moved in the morning wind. Somewhere behind them a meadowlark started its song, the bright three-note phrase repeated twice. Thank you, he said. Simple as that. I am not afraid of saying true things, she said. They walked back to the ranch yard in the same easy step, not quite touching but close enough that their hands brushed once on the uneven ground, and neither of them moved away from it. October arrived, and with it the first of the payments, delivered in person because the distance was short enough, and neither of them could come up with a convincing argument for why he should simply mail it. He rode in on a Saturday morning with a bank draft, and she accepted it with a steady hand, and wrote him a receipt in the ledger she was keeping of the payments, a mirror of her father's handwriting but in her own hand. He stayed for dinner at Mrs. Tate's. This was no longer a notable event to anyone in Caldwell Crossing, which meant it had been noted and filed away, and was now simply part of the established order of things in the way that small-town life absorbed new facts. Mrs. Hawthorne at the post office had already said something to Jennie about it, kindly but pointedly, in the way of a woman who considers herself the keeper of other people's hearts. Jennie had said that Roscoe Walden was a man of good character who was meeting a legitimate obligation, and Mrs. Hawthorne had said, "Yes, dear," and looked unsatisfied. Jennie did not discuss it with anyone else, but in the evenings, sitting with her mending by the lamp, she found herself placing the thought of him carefully at the center of her mind, and examining it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything else, and what she found there was not uncomplicated, but it was clear. She was falling in love with him. She had been falling in love with him since he set down his coffee mug on the porch railing very carefully so as not to spill it, and said that a man exploiting trust was not a failing of the person who trusted. She had been falling in love with him slowly and then all at once, the way the dawn came on the panhandle, slowly gray and then suddenly, completely, irreversibly golden. She did not say it. She was not afraid of true things, but she was careful with them. She wanted to be sure it was going toward something real, and not toward something that would require her to spend another 11 miles worth of fury to get clear of. November brought the cold, and with the cold, an unexpected complication. A man named Cal Harker arrived in Caldwell Crossing on a Wednesday with 2 companions and set up at the saloon with the specific purpose, it turned out, of disputing the eastern boundary of the Walden property. Harker claimed to hold a prior deed to the section that ran along the creek, a section that had good water and good grass, and that Roscoe had been running cattle on for 7 years. Harker's claim was questionable, his documentation patchy, but he had friends in the county seat who were making it seem more substantial than it was, and by the end of the week it had become a genuine problem. Jennie heard about it through the post office, as she heard about most things in town, and she sat with it for a day before going to the ranch on a Thursday evening, which was not their usual time, and knocking on his door. He looked tired when he opened it, the kind of tired that was not just the body but the mind working past its natural hours. "Come in," he said. She came in. She sat at the table. She said, "Tell me about the Harker claim." He told her, going through the documents spread on the table. She read them carefully. She had not had legal training, but she had spent years reading her father's contracts and disputes with more attention than most people brought to documents, and she had a quality of mind that found gaps in reasoning. She found 3 in Harker's documentation, one of them significant enough that she sat back in her chair and said, "The date on this deed is wrong. Look at the survey marker references. They cite the post that was set when the county line was redrawn in 1871. but the deed itself is dated 1869. The post was not there in 1869. This document is backdated. Roscoe looked at where she was pointing. He looked at it for a long time. He got up and went to his desk and came back with the county survey record he had, and they laid the two documents side by side, and the discrepancy was unmistakable. "If you take that to Monroe," she said, "and he takes it to the county seat, this falls apart." "They will say it was a clerical error," Roscoe said. "Then they will have to prove when the clerical error was made," she said, "which is harder than it sounds when the error aligns perfectly with a fraudulent claim." He looked at her. He looked at the documents. He looked back at her. "You found this in 20 minutes, he said. "I look for gaps," she said. "My father had his gap found too late." I do not like gaps in important documents. The Harker claim was brought to Monroe within the week, and Monroe, who had a competence that Jennie respected more each time she encountered it, took it to the county seat with the survey discrepancy clearly annotated. The claim was dismissed at the end of November, and Harker and his companions left town on a cold morning with nothing to show for their trouble. Roscoe came to the post office the afternoon after he received the news. It was a gray day, the first real winter sky pressing down on the town, and he came in and stood at the counter and said, "The claim was dismissed." "I heard," she said. "You know what you did," he said. "I want you to know that I know it." "I did the same thing you did," she said. "I looked at something carefully and said what I found." He came around the counter, which was a thing he did not ordinarily do, and she had a second to note the change before he was standing quite close to her, and he said quietly, "Jennie." It was the first time he had used her first name. She felt it somewhere in the center of her chest. "Roscoe," she said. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, just the backs of his fingers against her cheek, light and careful. "I think you already know how I feel," he said, "but I want to say it plainly if you will let me." "Say it," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time, and I did not say it because I did not want you to think I had some other purpose, with the debt and the agreement and all of it. I wanted those things to be clean, and I wanted this to be separate, but I cannot keep being quiet about it." She looked at him. She thought about 11 miles of fury and eggs she had not asked for, and the sound of a meadowlark and his hand brushing hers on the uneven ground. "You are not the only one who has been quiet," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, once, carefully, the way he did most things, giving the moment its full weight. She kissed him back, and neither of them was in a hurry. They stood in the back room of the post office on a gray November afternoon while the town went about its business outside, and they held on to the moment as long as it lasted. When they finally separated, she looked up at him and she thought again about the word small, about not becoming small, and she thought that this man had not once tried to make her smaller. Not once. He had done nothing but look at her directly and say the truest thing he could find. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been since you apologized without being asked." He smiled that full smile, the one she had been cataloging since August. "You came looking for an argument," he said. "I came looking for what was right," she said. "Same as you." December on the Panhandle was cold and brilliantly clear, the sky going a deep glacial blue that Jennie had always thought was its most beautiful version, honest about the temperature and extravagant about the color. She spent Christmas at the ranch because Roscoe had asked her, and because she had no other family to spend it with, and because wanting to go was reason enough. She arrived on Christmas Eve in the wagon she had borrowed from the hardware man's wife, who had given her a long, meaningful look and said to have a wonderful time. The wagon held a small cedar tree she had cut herself from the creek bank and tied with red ribbon, and a tin of sugar cookies she had made from her mother's recipe. She set the tree in the corner of the main room by the bookshelves, and Roscoe looked at it with an expression she could not entirely read, but that had a quality of move to it, something that was not quite his everyday steadiness. "My mother had a tree every Christmas," he said. "She died when I was 13. My father did not keep the tradition." Jennie looked at the small cedar tree in the corner of the big plain room, and then at Roscoe and thought about the boy of 13 losing his mother in this house, inheriting a complicated father, growing up in the shape that absence leaves. "Then we will keep it," she said. They ate dinner together by the stove, just the two of them since the ranch hands had their own Christmas Eve celebrations. Silas had left a pot roast before going, and Jennie contributed her cookies and a jar of pickled peaches that she had been holding back from ordinary days for an occasion. They talked and ate, and the stove threw warm orange light across everything, and outside the sky was full of stars, more than Jennie could count, burning cold and permanent and indifferent to everything below them. After dinner they sat by the fire, and Roscoe told her about the cattle drive when he was 16, really told her this time, the whole of it, the storms and the river crossings and the men who had worked alongside him. A Tejano cowboy named Ignacio who had taught him how to read weather by the way the cattle moved. A young man from Missouri named Tucker who had played harmonica at night and had been the best at cutting cattle Roscoe had ever seen in his life. She told him about the book she was currently making her way through, a history of the Spanish missions in Texas, and about the injustice she found in it, the patterns of land and labor that repeated themselves across different names in different centuries, and how she thought understanding those patterns was the only way to stop repeating them. He listened to her with his full attention, and when she paused he said, "I think about that, about what the land cost. I run cattle on ground that the Comanche rode freely for centuries before they were pushed off it. I try not to forget that. I do not know entirely what to do with it, but I think forgetting is the first wrong step." She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. It was the first time she had reached for him rather than the other way around, and he looked down at their joined hands, and then up at her with something in his face that she thought might be the most honest thing she had ever been handed. They watched the fire burn down together, and the stars burned outside, and neither of them was in any hurry for the night to end. January brought a cold that settled into the bones of the panhandle and refused to leave, and with it a question that had been circling the edges of their conversations, and that arrived, finally, on a Sunday afternoon when they were walking the creek trail and the cottonwoods were bare and rattling in the wind. He stopped on the trail and she stopped with him. He was looking at the creek, which was running low and dark with cold. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. He turned and looked at her, and she saw the steadiness there, the same steadiness from that first morning on the porch, but with something extra in it now, something she recognized as wanting and hoping together. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I am not asking because of the debt, which will continue to be paid as agreed regardless of anything else. I am asking because I would like to spend the rest of my life having conversations with you, and because you found a forged date in a fraudulent deed in 20 minutes, and because you brought a cedar tree for Christmas, and because you are the most direct person I have ever known and I love you. Those are my reasons." She stood on the trail with the bare cottonwoods rattling and the cold creek running and the whole enormous sky above them, and she thought about the 11 miles and the eggs and the ledgers and the tree in the corner and his hand on her face and "I am in love with you." "Yes," she said, "those are good reasons. Mine are similar." He kissed her there on the trail with the cold wind turning their faces red, and held her for a long moment after, and she could feel how warm he was under his coat, the solid reality of him, and she thought this was what it felt like to arrive somewhere you had not known you were heading. They were married in March, when the panhandle was coming back to life, the first green pushing up through the winter-yellowed grass, the sky going soft with the change of season. The ceremony was at the small church in Caldwell Crossing, performed by the minister whose wife Jennie had sewn 3 dresses for, and attended by most of the town because news traveled at the speed of intention in a place that small. Old Monroe was there. Mrs. Hawthorne was there, and she wept in a way that suggested she felt personally responsible for the outcome. Silas was there, standing at the back in his best shirt, looking uncomfortable but present. A handful of the other ranch hands came in from the Walden property, smelling of soap and looking as though they had combed their hair for the first time in months. Jennie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had been saving for something worthy, a deep blue that matched the winter sky, with cream lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bunch of early wildflowers tied with ribbon. She walked down the aisle on her own, because there was no one to give her away and she did not need anyone to. And she walked steadily and directly the way she did everything. Roscoe stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and his face did the thing it did, the going still and then the quiet, and then she arrived next to him and he looked at her and said, very quietly so only she could hear, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever seen." She looked back at him. "You are not so ordinary yourself," she said. The minister performed the ceremony. They said the words. When he said she could be kissed, Roscoe took her face in both his hands and kissed her once, firmly, with his whole attention, and several people in the pews made sounds of pleasure and approval that the minister pretended not to hear. They had the reception at Mrs. Tate's dining room, which Mrs. Tate had decorated with improbable quantities of ribbon and wildflowers, and there was cake, an actual cake with white icing, that Mrs. Hawthorne had made, and that caused considerable admiration. The ranch hands ate 3 times their share and looked happier for it. Someone produced a fiddle and there was dancing, the practical fast kind that the frontier bred, not the formal kind. Roscoe danced with Jennie 3 times and talked to his neighbors, and watched his bride move through the room with the directness and warmth that he had decided within 20 minutes of first meeting her was the most attractive quality a person could have. And he thought about the debt that had brought her to his porch in fury, and what a strange and merciful thing it was, what life did with the rawest material. Spring deepened. Jennie moved to the ranch, bringing her sewing box, her books, her father's ledgers, the tin box with the deed to nothing and the watch and the 3 Kansas letters, and the 2 copies of a contract that showed what was owed and what would be repaid. She put the tin box on the bookshelf next to the Texas history and the other books, and the first morning she came downstairs to the kitchen of the ranch house and made coffee and stood at the window watching the dawn light go from gray to gold across the grass. She felt her father's watch sitting in that tin box on the shelf, and she thought, "I did not stay angry for too long, and I think you would be pleased." She said as much to Roscoe when he came in from checking the horses, and he listened to her say it and then said, "I think he would be more than pleased. I think he would have respected you for how you handled it." "He respected directness," she said. "He would have found you tolerable," Roscoe laughed. "High praise." "From a Brenner, yes," she said. The ranch changed with her presence, not dramatically but in the way that things change when a careful and capable person brings their attention to them. She set up a proper account system for the household, something more thorough than Roscoe had been keeping. And what she found in the first month was that money had been leaking out of the household accounts in small, undirected ways that added up to a significant sum over a year. She fixed it without drama, showed Roscoe the corrections, and he looked at the figures and then at her and said, "You should have been keeping these books from the beginning." "You were managing," she said. "I was surviving," he said. "You are managing." She also found in the back of the large desk in the small office off the main room a file of papers that made her go still for a long moment before she called for Roscoe. They were correspondence between Harold Walden and a cattle buyer in Kansas, correspondence that made it clear that the forged note on the Brenner property was not the only questionable transaction Harold Walden had engaged in, though it was the one most clearly documented. There were 2 other names she did not recognize in the letters. She set the papers on the desk in front of Roscoe and let him read them. He read them in silence and sat back when he was finished. "There are other people who were wronged," she said. "Yes," he said. "What do you want to do about it?" she asked. He looked at the papers for a moment. "Find them if I can, and do the same thing I did with you." It took most of the spring to locate the other 2 parties mentioned in Harold Walden's correspondence. One was a family named Castillo, who had lost a portion of range land and had moved on from the area years before. Monroe helped Roscoe track down an address for their eldest son in San Antonio. The other was a widow named Mrs. Pike, who was still living on a smaller property outside a town called Laverty, 40 miles south. Roscoe wrote letters and went in person to Mrs. Pike and came back from Laverty late on a Thursday evening looking tired and resolved. He sat down at the kitchen table and Jennie brought him coffee and sat across from him. "How did it go?" she asked. "She cried," he said. She did not cry because she was sad. She cried because she said she had spent 15 years thinking her husband must have made some mistake, that there was something he had done that was genuinely wrong, because a powerful man would not just take something without reason. She blamed him for it all this time. Jennie was quiet. "I told her the truth," Roscoe said, "that her husband had not made a mistake, that my father had targeted him deliberately and had manufactured a reason." She cried because she had been wrong about her husband for 15 years, and because she could now stop being wrong. Jennie reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You did the right thing," she said. "I know," he said. "It is still hard." "The right things usually are," she said. "That is how you know they are worth doing." He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while in the kitchen of the ranch house with the spring evening settling in around them, the window open and the smell of new grass coming through, the last of the daylight going orange on the wall. The arrangements for the Castillo family were more complicated, involving a letter and a long correspondence with the son in San Antonio. But they arrived at a fair agreement by the summer, and Roscoe signed another document with Monroe and sent the first bank draft south. By midsummer, Jennie was expecting their first child. She told Roscoe on a morning in June when the heat was already considerable by breakfast time, and the ranch yard smelled of dust and cattle. She told him plainly, sitting across from him at the same table where she had eaten eggs she had not asked for on the morning that changed everything, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he looked up at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, open and unguarded and bright. He said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am also, I believe, somewhat astonished." "So am I," he said. He got up and came around the table and took her hands in both of his, standing over her, and then he crouched down beside her chair so they were eye level, which was a thing she found remarkably dear of him, and he said, "I am so happy I do not know what to do with it." She laughed. "You could go check the east fence," she said. "It has been worrying you for a week." "It can wait," he said. It waited. He sat beside her at the breakfast table for another hour, and they talked about what was coming. And the conversation ranged from practical to tender and back again, with the ease of two people who had long since stopped being afraid of either register. The baby came in January, right on the cusp of the new year, born in the ranch house bedroom in a cold snap that frosted the windows and filled the room with the heat of the wood stove. The birth was attended by Mrs. Tate, who had delivered more babies than she cared to count. And by the end of a long and difficult night, a son was placed in Jennie's arms, red-faced and furious and absolutely present. Roscoe was in the room because Jennie had insisted, and Mrs. Tate had been practical about it, and when the boy arrived he stood at the side of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and his face went through that going, still and then something else. Something that did not have a name but that Jennie recognized as the truest thing she had seen in a long and eventful year of seeing true things. They named him Robert for her father. Robert Walden was not a quiet baby. He was emphatic about his wants and his displeasures, vocal in ways that carried clearly across the ranch yard, and he grew with the sturdy purpose of someone who had decided from his first day that he intended to be present and accounted for. By 6 months, he was already trying to pull himself upright against anything he could reach. By the time he was a year old, he was into everything, following Silas around the yard with the focused dedication of a very small person who has decided that ranch work is the most interesting thing in the world. Silas, who had worked this land for 20 years and had no family of his own that Jennie knew of, took to the baby with a matter-of-fact warmth that touched her every time she saw it. He had an old trick of balancing a coin on the back of his hand and flipping it into the air for Robert to follow with wide, fascinated eyes, and he did it with the same patience every time the boy demanded it, which was frequent. The quarterly payments continued. Jennie kept the ledger. The total shrank not quickly but steadily, the way steady things do. At the end of the second year, she sat down with the books and calculated what was remaining and what the timeline looked like if the ranch continued on its current trajectory. And what she found was that the debt would be cleared within 3 more years, which was earlier than the original schedule had allowed for. She brought this to Roscoe on a Sunday evening, the books open on the table, and showed him the figures. He studied them. He looked at her. "Is that right?" he said. "The cattle prices were better this year," she said, "and the household accounts run tighter than your father ran them." "Then I ran them," he said honestly. "Then any of us ran them before I looked at them," she said. "The point is 3 years, possibly fewer." He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ledger, at her father's handwriting in the early pages and hers in the later ones, at the careful record of every payment against every wrong. "I want it paid in full," he said. "When the last entry is made, I want to sit with you and look at those books and know it is clean." "It will be," she said. He reached across and covered her hand. She turned hers over and held his. Robert turned 2 in January and demonstrated his feelings about this achievement by falling into the water trough, which led to a cold bath and a series of opinions expressed at considerable volume. By spring of that year, the ranch was running better than it had in a decade, a fact that Roscoe attributed to the combination of a good cattle market, honest accounting, and having someone who read the weather as well as any man he had ever worked with. Jennie had learned weather reading from Silas, who had learned it from Ignacio-style observation of the cattle and the sky, and she had combined it with her own habit of attention to produce an instinct that had twice this season got the herd moved before a bad storm came through. Roscoe told her this with a pride that was entirely genuine and not condescending, the pride of someone who recognized a partner's skills clearly, and she received it in that spirit. They had the kind of marriage that people in Caldwell Crossing talked about, not with gossip, but with something that functioned like admiration, because it was visible from the outside, even to people who had no stake in it, that these two people genuinely respected each other, and that respect was not performed. It was simply the way they operated. Mrs. Hawthorne told Jennie once directly that watching the two of them made her believe certain things were possible that she had begun to doubt. Jennie said that was very kind and meant it. The summer of 1881 was a good one, warm but not brutal, and the grass held. The cattle were fat and the prices were fair, and the ranch ran as Roscoe had always hoped it could. He rode his fences and managed his men, and came home in the evenings to a house that was alive in ways the house had not been alive for most of his life in it, to the sound of Robert demanding something with great conviction and Jennie's voice answering him, steady and warm, and the smell of cooking that indicated someone had actually planned a meal rather than improvising from what was left. He would stand sometimes in the doorway of the main room before announcing himself and listen, and the contentment he felt was quiet and complete, the kind that does not announce itself because it has no need to. Late in that summer, Jennie told him she was expecting again. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Very certain that this one will be as opinionated as his brother," she said. "It might be a daughter," he said. "It might," she said. "She would be equally opinionated. It is the family character." He laughed and pulled her close and pressed his mouth to her hair and held on. The second child arrived in February of 1882, and the child was indeed a daughter, born on a cold morning that was nevertheless brighter than Robert's birth had been, the sun coming through the bedroom windows and filling the room with winter light. She was placed in Jennie's arms and looked at the world with great seriousness, as if she had opinions already forming. They named her Clara, for no particular reason other than that it seemed to fit her face. Clara Walden, who arrived with a full head of dark hair and her mother's quality of paying close attention to whatever was in front of her. Robert was introduced to his sister with a formal seriousness that made both his parents struggle not to smile. He looked at her for a long time and then looked up at Roscoe and said, loud, because he had heard the considerable sound of his sister's arrival from the other room. "She has something to say," Roscoe told him. "Okay," Robert said, apparently satisfied, and went back to the yard. The ranch hands were delighted in their various private ways. Silas produced a small carved horse from somewhere, smooth and careful work, which he presented to Clara with a formality that suggested it had taken some time to make. She regarded it with the same seriousness she brought to everything. The spring of 1882 found the Walden Ranch running smoothly. A family of 4 settled into the rhythms of the land and each other. Jennie had her sewing, which she kept up for her own purposes and some regular clients in town, and her books, and her account ledgers and her children, and the evening conversations that she and Roscoe had kept as the constant through every season, the practice of being fully present and fully honest with each other, that neither of them had ever had to name because it was simply how they both operated. She brought the ledger to the kitchen table one evening in May, and she set it open at the last page, and she said, "Look." Roscoe came and looked over her shoulder. He read the final entry. He read the total at the bottom. He read the balance remaining, which was 0. He was quiet for a moment. He put his hand on her shoulder. "That is it," he said. "That is it," she said. "Paid in full, all of it." He pulled the chair next to her and sat down, and they looked at the ledger together, at her father's handwriting in the first pages and hers in the last, at the long, careful record of something being made right. She had brought the ledger not just with the repayment record but with the original books, her father's books, and they sat side by side on the table now, the whole of it, what had been done and what had been done to repair it. She ran her fingers across her father's handwriting on an early page, his careful small letters, and thought about the man who had sat in a shop smelling of leather and worked steadily and kept his books and taught his daughter to value honesty and directness and the willingness to say the true thing. She thought about what he had said at the end, that he hoped she would not be angry for too long because it was heavy to carry. "It is done," she said. Roscoe put his arm around her. He would be proud, he said, of how this went. He would have liked you, she said, which was a revision of what she had once said about him being tolerable, and they both knew it. "I would have worked hard to earn that," he said. "I know you would have," she said. "That is why it is true." She closed the ledger. The accounts were settled. The debt was paid. The record was clean. Outside the window the May evening was long and blue, the light staying late the way it did in spring, and the sound of Robert playing in the yard drifted in alongside the smell of new grass and horses, and the particular warm dust of the panhandle. Clara was asleep upstairs, her carved horse on the shelf beside the bed where Silas had shown her it belonged. On the bookshelf in the front room, the tin box sat between the Texas history and a new book Jennie had ordered from Kansas City, a collection of letters from a woman who had traveled through the Western Territories, which Roscoe was reading with great interest. The tin box held the deed to nothing, her father's watch, the 3 Kansas letters, and now also the settled contract, fully paid, its final line in her handwriting neat and absolute. Roscoe had taken the small cedar tree from the December before last and planted it at the corner of the house, and it was growing, not large yet but present and green and rooted. He had done this because she mentioned once that she liked seeing living things settle in. He remembered the things she mentioned once. That had not changed. She stood up from the table and he stood with her, as he always did, and she gathered the ledgers and put them on the shelf where they would stay. She turned around and he was there in the kitchen of the ranch house that had been cold and empty for most of his life, and that was now warm and full, and she looked at him the way she had looked at things since she was young enough to understand that looking carefully was the most respectful thing you could offer anything. He looked back at her the same way. "What do you want for supper?" he said. She laughed, the full sound of it, the one that had surprised her the first time she heard it come out of herself at the creek bank. "Something simple," she said. "I have had enough of complicated things for one day." "Simple it is," he said. He moved to the stove and she got down the tin plates from the shelf, and the evening settled around them, warm and ordinary and entirely theirs. Robert came banging in from the yard wanting to know if there were biscuits, which there were, because Jennie had made them that afternoon. He accepted 2 of them with great seriousness and went to wash his hands at the pump without being asked, which she noted internally as a small victory. Clara woke just as the food was ready, her small voice announcing itself from upstairs, and Roscoe went up and came back down with her on his arm, her dark hair tousled, and her expression thoughtful in the way she had even fresh from sleep, as if she had been considering something carefully even in her dreams. They sat together at the long dark table in the warm kitchen, the 4 of them, and the lamp burned steady and the stove radiated its even heat, and outside the panhandle sky was going through its spectacular evening colors, the whole impossible palette from gold to crimson to the deep final blue. Jennie looked around the table, at her son eating a biscuit with a focused earnestness, at her daughter holding her carved horse and occasionally offering it a small piece of bread, at the man across from her who had said "I am sorry" without defense and "I am in love with you" without strategy, and had spent 3 years making good on every promise he made. She looked at his face and he caught her looking and raised an eyebrow just slightly, that small signal between people who have learned each other's language. She shook her head, smiling. "Nothing, just looking." He smiled back, the full version, the one she had been collecting since August of 1878. She had ridden 11 miles in fury to demand an accounting, and she had been given one freely and without defense, and what came after was something she could not have mapped from the start of that road, could not have imagined standing at the gate looking up at the Burnwood sign with her hands shaking and her jaw set. What came after was this table, this light, this life. She had not stayed angry for too long. Her father, she thought, would have found that exactly right. And the evening went on around them. The ranch settled into its night sounds, the cattle distant in the grass, the horses quiet in the barn, the stars coming out one by one over the enormous Texas sky, burning cold and permanent above the place where 2 people had found each other at the intersection of an old wrong and the willingness to make it right, and had built something out of that unlikely meeting that would last in ways neither of them could fully count. In the accounts they kept, and the children who would keep accounts of their own someday, in the house that was finally warm, in the land under all of it that held them all equally and without judgment, as land does, asking only that the people who stood on it bring something honest to the standing. They brought that. They had always brought that. The lamp burned. The family sat. The night came on slowly, the way night came on in a place with no walls between the sky and the people who lived under it, and it was gentle, and it held them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.